Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Plexus International 6 Golden Rules to Strengthening Your APQP. As you can see, we have some excellent program planned for today, and the pre-slides we showed some excellent programs that we have up and coming, specifically our live virtual seminars that are starting next week for some basic understanding APQP and FEMA. And then 2 weeks later, we also have more advanced live virtual workshops. And these are just 2 hour down and dirty, get it done approach to training, very cost effective. We also have some other unique programs coming up. We're presently dipping our feet into the pond of ISO 27001, CMMC, TZAC, NIST. So a lot of good things. If you'd like more information, just let us know. So on to you didn't come here to listen to me, I know that. So on to what we came here for. Let me introduce Jeremy Hazel. He's our lead consultant. He's actually our lead trainer as well, one of our lead trainers. He's been with Plexus International for longer than he likes to actually tell you. He's the author of Memory Joggers for ISO 9001, AS 9100, 13485, and IATF, as well as Risk-Based Thinking book, both books published by Goal QPC. Jeremy specializes in small training development and risk-based thinking implementation strategy. He's extraordinary at what he does, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this presentation. With that, Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill. And good afternoon to everybody, or good morning, depending on where we find you. So you guys have elected to spend the hour with me, right? And so you folks are here for the 6 golden rules to strengthen your APQP. So one of the things I like to do, as Bill said, it doesn't matter whether it's aerospace, automotive, medical device, general business. APQP is one of those things that is universal. And in all fairness, we can all agree that at least if we all know what APQP is, it is a $7 word way of saying project management, right? So what APQP seeks to do is take something from concept to launch. And the tool that we choose to use in the automotive world is APQP. So what I'd like to do in explaining this out, I want to set the table so that we can eat a bit later. And I'm going to kind of go through what I see and what I have seen as a consultant over the last decade, because what Bill didn't cover is for the last 10 years, I've been going into companies, and part of my job is turning the companies around. And the tools that I use when it comes to turnaround are APQP, FMEA, and a special brand of auditing that we do. So today's subject is one that is very near and dear to my heart, because I believe that the very act of planning in the early stages creates better outcomes once we're in the middle of the firefight, once we're out in the middle of the road. So what I'd like to do to kind of kick this off, I will tell you that I do not believe in death by PowerPoint. I do have some concepts that it is easier to get across via PowerPoint. And so I'd like to share the first slide with you here, and then we'll do some live draw. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. All right, bringing this up. And anybody that's been with me in any of my classes for any length of time knows I don't do death by PowerPoint. So we're going to keep this very interactive, entertaining, and my job is to keep the energy level up for the full hour that we're going to be doing this. All right, so when we talk about APQP, I think it's important to talk about from the user's perspective what I see when I go into organizations that are struggling. And the first thing that I see when I go into struggling organizations, post-launch, they are trying to restore the standards that they agreed to during the quotation. So what happens usually is we've launched a product in mass production, we've gone through the PPAP, and now the scrap rates, the cycle times, the PPM are not matching what we expected. So one of my first things when I go on is I have to triage. So there are certain tools for certain things. And we have entire other, say, seminars and such that go through the hierarchy of these tools. And during the restoration of the standards, you may use the control plan, because the control plan is the manifestation of the control strategy that you have decided to use. So that really becomes your standard. Once we get the triage done, once we get them stable in the field, then we have to move backward into the theoretical. And for those that are familiar with the operations document flow, the control plan is driven by the FMEA. So a lot of times, once you've stopped the bleeding, you now have to go back to the FMEA to figure out what you were supposed to be doing in the first place. This takes a little bit of time, but eventually, what people eventually discover is that once you are able to then achieve the theoretical standard that you set in terms of your risk profile for your project, the only way to reach that aspirational goal, that perfect state, is to really include APQP and to do a lot of the pre-planning upfront. We'll talk a little bit later about y equals f of x, which is a pretty good indication of how people perform. But the thing that I want to cover here is that if you are having struggles in your launch, is a direct result from poor planning during the planning for said launch. And I think that while I might work in aerospace, automotive, medical device, I want to kind of explain why APQP is used. And I'm not touting, say, automotive's horn unnecessarily here, but in reality, APQP is a form of planning, and we do a phenomenal job of it in the automotive world. Think about the fact that we change models every so many years. And by models, I mean complete platforms of vehicle. We make millions of vehicles a year with upwards of 40,000 SKUs per vehicle. And we are measuring failure rates in parts per million. Some of us are even measuring failure rates in parts per billion. And so we really are setting that standard in terms of how do you take a high volume product that competes in the regulatory space and has ever increasing customer requirements. The reason I say customer requirements, even in aerospace, you don't see the average airline traveler requesting more and more and more out of their airline, but you do see car buyers requesting more and more integrated features year on year. Now, what does this do for you? Quite frankly, we're going to go ahead here and we're going to use this planning operation to direct our resources. Now, this is an important designation. This seminar is not going to be the traditional seminar where I've mentioned customer satisfaction. Okay, this seminar is just about as much customer as it is supplier. So, as a supplier, you need to utilize APQP in order to direct your resources. If you do not plan well, you will have under allocation of resources and an overcommitment that you cannot possibly hold out on. It also allows you to identify required changes and avoid the late changes. You folks know as well as I do that the further you go down the project management timeline, the costs rise substantially. And on the subject of cost, if you engage in APQP, this allows you to produce the best product at the lowest cost. Okay, so that's some of the reasons why you want to do this. Now, let me go ahead. I'm going to stop my share here for just a second. And if you have questions, don't worry. We got 10, 15 minutes at the end here where we'll address them. And I want to do some live draw with you folks. Now, when we talk about APQP, it's important to begin with the end in mind. What is the objective of APQP? Because before you can get to the 6 golden rules, you've really got to figure out what you are trying to do with this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share out my screen for just a second. Let's go ahead and bring this up just like that. And there we go. Magic time. All right, let's bring on a new sheet for a new day. The 3 indicators of APQP. Let me go ahead and bring this up here. We're just going to go ahead and make this black so we can see it a little better. The 3 indicators of APQP: on time, on spec, and on budget. Folks, all product launch, regardless of if it's in aerospace, regardless if it's in medical device, regardless if it's in automotive, all operate on the same factors. And on time simply refers to milestones. On spec refers to things like scrap rates. It refers to things like PPM. It could refer to things like warranty. And on budget, that refers honestly to the millions of dollars that go flooding out of an organization every time they bring on a job. And so, as we get into the mechanics of APQP and these 6 rules, I want to be very clear with you. We are going to be talking about these 6 rules in relationship to this particular targeting, okay? And when we talk about the 6 rules, I also want to make perfectly clear that what we're talking about largely, we're going to be talking about intent. The 6 rules that we're going to be giving you are general, everyday rules, which are simple, but may not be inherently easy. So for each tool, we're going to be giving you some options in terms of how you might implement it. But the final decision about how you implement is 110% up to your organization, because we do not know your organization, we do not know your commodity, and we don't even know your industry. Some of you may be automotive, some of you may be aerospace, and it does make a difference.
And Jeremy, there's a question that I think might be helpful if we address it now. One of the questions that I have is is APQP widely used on aeronautical? It is not known with the same name. Could you clarify that?
All right, absolutely. The short answer is it depends. Let me do the conversion here. Automotive utilizes APQP. Aerospace has a parallel set of tools. The equivalency of APQP is AS 9145. So they are different tools, but I will tell you, because I do teach them both, Plexus teaches them both, they are almost identical. I can count on one hand the number of changes. And so the universal 6 principles that I'm going to tell you, the 6 golden rules as we put it, will be the same for aerospace as they are for automotive, as they are for medical device. 100%. I don't even care if you manufacture something that isn't even in those 3 realms. Let's say you make universal fasteners. The reason why we wanted to teach this, and the reason why I really want to teach this the way that I do, is because these intents, these golden rules, are genuinely universal. Now, one thing I'd like to do to kind of prove the universality of some of this, we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a poll. Now, this is the first interaction you're going to see with me, right? We're trying to make this highly interactive. Nothing is worse than going through an hour with somebody with death by PowerPoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to see the first poll come up. This will help me over the next, say, 50 minutes, go ahead and calibrate my front side focus. So there are 3 questions to this first poll. How well do you feel your organization performs APQP, also known as program management? And then here's the $1 million question. How well do you feel your suppliers perform? All right. Now, I have a rule. The fun stops when I hit about 80% of respondents. So if you want to get out of here sooner, make sure you participate, because if I don't hit 80%, the fun keeps rolling. And we will share the results of this poll once we're done. So this is going to tell you that you are unique, but you are not different. Couple more minutes to let some of those leg stragglers in. Right, let's go ahead and kill it here. All right, we're going to end this and let's go ahead and share the results here. Now, the nice thing is, folks, for those that are statistical process speakers, given no natural barriers, a say perfect distribution or a normal distribution is formed with enough data points. Notice how in the question of how well you feel your organization does, a fair amount of you hugged the center line with 3. So on a scale of 1 to 5, you would say you are pretty average. Now, the same thing is relatively true here with the difference of a couple percentage points. You feel your suppliers perform APQP generally a little bit lower than some others. Now, this is not uncommon paradigm that customers have about suppliers. And here in a little bit, I'll explain to you why. And lastly, what component of APQP do you feel your organization is weakest in? Folks, the majority of our training here at Plexus in one form or another is the process FMEA. So the good news is your assumption matches our sales data. So the good news is you are unique, but you are not different. And everything that's going to come out of my mouth, because I know what's on the other half of the slide deck, is going to support exactly this. So you get a lot of value out of today. I'm not a big fan of non-value add presentations. So let's go ahead and keep this party rolling here. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share a screen here. This is one that you are probably universally aware of here. This is an average APQP flow. Now, I talked a little bit about this. All of the experience you have in mass production is the direct result for the quality of event leading up to launch. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about this here in a little bit, but Y equals F of X. For those who are Six Sigma speakers, this equation describes a majority of the experiences we have as human beings. The way you read this, if this is the first time you've ever seen this, Y is an output. The Y is a function of X, which is input. So the output of mass production is a function of the inputs from your planning phase all the way back. And so if I come in and I have to restore the standards post-launch, it is 100% due to the decisions that you made during APQP. So if you're looking for the high value target, instead of firefighting, because the bad news is you can't change an output, you can only monitor it. The only way out of pain is to do a better job of the inputs. And that term, quality of event, is a big one. The quality of event for your APQP is important. So let's take a look at how these two sides differ. Now, this slide is a very important slide for both customers and suppliers. You folks remember there used to be a little newspaper cartoon running around where there were 2 people 180 degrees apart, and one of them was looking at the number 6 on the ground, and they were swearing it was the number 6. Meanwhile, the person 180 degrees from them swore it was 9 because they were looking at it from a different perspective. And the general thing for this cartoon is they were both right. It depended on how you read the number in terms of where you were standing in relationship to it. This is true of the customer-supplier relationship. So for my customers in the room that engage in supplier management, this is what the customer largely thinks. When you look at APQP, the customer largely thinks they have defined all of their requirements and that the supplier inherently understands all their expectations. The customer determines the documentation for the processes or method, and they think that the supplier is going to adequately carry them out. However, On the supplier side, on the blue side, think about your supply base. Largely, they are specialists. You have chosen them to supply because they have made the part, multiple iterations of the part for different customers for several years. And so when they hear APQP, they look at it as a delta to what they do because it is part of their core competency. They have parts with similar characteristics. They already may have family documents. So family FMEAs, family control plans, such as a screw turning machine. If you turn a screw, you've got major diameters, minor diameters. And so many times customers don't understand the viewpoint from the supplier perspective. And suppliers largely fail to ask enough questions so that they understand what the customer is asking for. So when you go to your supplier, and this happened in the data, y'all said you did a pretty good job on a scale of 1 to 5, right? With a 3. However, you said your suppliers did a less than stellar job at a 2. And this is because the further you go down the tier chain, the less they understand the needs of the customer above them. Think about it if you're a plater. And I don't know who all is out there in webinar world, but if you are Joe's Plating Shack, let's say, and you are a local plater, automotive may be only 5% of your business. And so when you think about APQP, if you are that next tier higher, automotive is probably a larger percentage of your business, and you are asking the supply base, who's your supplier, to engage in the same level of activity without the same level of resource. This is a huge realization that many people have to get to. And this is an important one when it comes to APQP. Why? Because quite frankly, what happens is the level of activity from a supplier will not be the same level of activity from the tier above. So as long as we understand the paradigm and as long as we understand what each party brings to the table, we're now able to get into the 6 rules. And I think it's an important thing that there is no standard of event in APQP. How a tier 10th supplier will engage in APQP is different than a tier 1. Okay. And it's up to the customer, hear me very carefully, to either accept the level of activity from that supplier or to force that supplier down to a level where they will meet your needs and risk potentially blowing up the business. There's no perfect answer. It is 110% contractual negotiation. That being said, let's dig into rule 1. And rule 1, these are organized very specifically, by the way. Rule 1 of APQP. The multidisciplinary team you put together must be both competent and effective. Now, competency comes in 2 flavors. There is technical competency. What I'm going to say here, this is technical awareness, right? And then there is emotional intelligence. This is awareness of the organizational landscape. So whomever you have on this multidisciplinary team must not only be competent, which means they have the skills to pay the bills. Defined competence means the ability to apply training and knowledge, but they also have to be effective. In order to be effective, they have to know themselves as well as they look toward the outside world. You have to know your availability of resources. You have to look at your familiarity with the technologies needed. And chances are, if it is the first time you are working with that customer, you may not know all of their customer requirements. Many times, the first APQP, a supplier and a customer engaging together, it is a feeling out type of session. I'm feeling you out as the customer, you're feeling me out as the supplier to determine in later jobs how we work together. And the last thing here is that both parties need to understand the tools that you'll be expected to utilize. If you go to Joe's Plating House, let's say, and they don't understand FMEA, and you have a very stringent FMEA process, you will have a larger road to go than if you were working with somebody that already had a working knowledge of these tools. This will come back later in terms of supplier learning management. The other thing for my customers in the room, they need to possess a certain level of product awareness. And if you do not communicate things like product intent, where it's intended to be used, i.e. the usage case, the expected performance, don't be surprised when the supplier misses those things during APQP. And if you are the supplier, because everybody gets their turn, right? Make sure that you understand how the customer is going to assemble your product, because you will get the same customer complaint for a failure in the field as you do for shutting down their line. So rule 1 is know yourself. And while it is not, say, new that you need a multidisciplinary team, I make a tremendous amount of money off from fixing poorly functional teams. It is important that the team be both competent and effective. I can have a team, but I guarantee you that an effective team is different than any other team. Now, in our training for FMEA, I just want to give you one tool here, and then we're going to move on to the second rule. Let me share this out. We want to do a live draw. What are the tools that comes from some of our techniques here? Let's go ahead and bring this up. In the new FMEA from VDA and AIAG, they talk about the 5 T's. Now, in this tool, they don't talk about the prioritization of the 5 T's. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add some prioritization to it. The first T is intent. Intent is synonymous with objective. If you are engaging in APQP, the objective needs to be very clear. What are the performance targets? Remember, on time, on spec, and on budget. Then you pull together the team. Then you look at the tools. Then you look at the timing. And lastly, you subdivide into the tasks. When we talk multidisciplinary team, this is an important designation. Think about NASA. Think about going to the moon. Do you think that NASA looks at the astronauts they have and decides what mission they're going to go on? Absolutely not. You decide on the mission, and then you staff it with the team that's intended to carry out that mission. That's the way it works. Any other way, it doesn't work. So one of the first things I would absolutely make sure you do in APQP, some sort of a project charter. So rule 1, make sure you have an effective, competent team. Without that, none of the other rules matter. All right, that is rule 1. Now, rule 2. Let's go ahead and take a look at rule 2 here. Establish multi-directional and robust information channels. I will tell you that most people, and especially in jobs that I have overseen, initiated the APQP process with very little regard to the communication channels. And I want to make sure that, because I have both customers and suppliers on this call, that we have multi-directional. And the way that I represent this here without being terribly wordy, information channels should provide the opportunity for effective exchange and resilient enough to survive the chaos of launch. This is why I say robust and multi-directional. I cannot tell you how many upper echelon tiers I have worked with that push information down one way. It is a one-way valve. And so one of the things that I want to make sure that we hear in your information channel, it needs to allow for a feedback loop, and it needs to allow for the supplier initiation of communication. So if the supplier has an issue, how do they initiate that? They don't sit on their hands and wait for you as the customer to say, do you have any questions? The communication flow also has to be timely. In stock trading or cryptocurrency trading, when you look at a time frame, if it's a 15-minute time frame, you look at the average moving range and you make a decision. If you do not have timely information, don't be surprised when you're then driving by looking in the rearview mirror. So your communication plan is paramount. Now, not everything has to be a formal meeting. Communication robustness based on the appropriate level of risks, and somehow you should embed this communication so you cannot skip to step 2 without communicating what has to go into step 2. And over here on the right, we have some very simple examples of how some of the documentation passes through the supply chain here. Now, notice here what we've got. A lot of your tolerances and specs are communicated through engineering drawings. You might have that engineering drawing, but do they fully understand it? That comes down to the robustness. Same thing with the possible risks. The PFMEA, and this is a big one. Could it be that some of the struggles around the PFMEA, which was the tool that the group largely agreed was the one they had the most problems with, is genuinely because the supplier may not be able to initiate an upward momentum of communication to voice their PFMEA concerns? And when they do, and I'm just going to say it, this is a blanket statement. Traditionally, those of us that do PFMEAs look at severity, occurrence, and detection. That traditionally has migrated into an RPN. And how many times have we said the RPN must be reduced so we can sign PPAP? And then guess what happens in the field when you launch? That risk profile that you said was too high comes to pass, and that's actually the performance. So rule 2 is about establishing robust information channels that are bi-directional. So the first rule, establish a team that is both competent and effective based on organizational knowledge and technical perspective. The second one is establish multi-directional channels that are robust enough to allow those groups to communicate. Anything less is going to be genuinely kind of a large failure. Now, let's go ahead, and I want to kind of frame out some of the other things that we're talking about today. Let's go ahead and stop this share here so that we can do this. Let's take a quick break after those 2 here and do something a little bit different. We're going to go ahead and do one more poll here, because when I get over to rule 3 and 4, this one's going to be important. All right, let's go ahead and launch this. All right, I'm interested when it comes to rule 3 and 4. How do you presently handle your APQP documentation and your preferred method of collaboration with your team? These will help me when it comes to rule 3 and 4. All right, and again, the fun stops when I hit around 80%. All right, let's go ahead and end polling on this one here. And let's go ahead and share results. All right, so the good news is most of you are unique, but not different. With limited exception, most of us are still doing the old Excel style documentation. And a lot of our communication is generally face-to-face. I did have a glance at the chat, and I did see some people who preferred face-to-face. However, COVID has greatly limited the amount of face-to-face communication that we can have. Even this being brought to us by Zoom, a lot of us have learned how to work with Zoom. So things like CTS software, things like different software programs are quickly eclipsing and becoming the way to get more robust communication that is not necessarily impacted even by global pandemic. So a lot of the software packages that will allow you to bring your supply base in, share and collaborate with documents in an Excel style format, let's say, and I'm not saying Excel is a program, I'm saying in a spreadsheet view that most of us are used to, maybe an option that's a good fit for you. All right, let's go ahead and take a look now at number 3. All right, the third rule: engage your lower tiered suppliers early. Okay. Now, this is something that not a lot of people understand. When it comes to the supply chain, the OEMs are working on vehicles that are 7+ years out. Okay. So they're working on the longest timeline. Your tier ones get kicked off somewhere around here. Your tier twos get kicked off somewhere here. And as you go down the tier chain, by the time you're like tier 10th, you got like 6 weeks. So the sooner you engage, even if you don't have all the answers, the better off your APQP is going to be. And realize that from the customer side, the first step with those multidisciplinary team that's both competent and effective, you establish those robust multi-directional channels, and then you engage your lower tier suppliers as early as you can. Because what you're going to do is the suppliers are going to take your requirements into their equivalent control methods. And so to do this, they have to understand the intent of the product, what their role is in early involvement, and the deliverables that they have at each phase. For those that are APQP speakers, one of the deliverables in phase 1, which is planning and prep, is preliminary process and product considerations and assumptions. That's the general definition of we're not sure how it's going to look when we finish, but you want to engage your supply base at that point. Do not wait for finished prints. The further you go down to that APQP flow, the less flexibility you have to make changes, and the more costly those changes are going to be. And remember up here in the corner, this is a good one here, and this is why I wanted to put this up here. When we do this, the view of the supplier and the customer, remember that previous slide, the supplier must either meet your APQP expectations or you must agree to their level of activity. Remember, it's a dual-edged sword. So if that supplier says, I'm pushing back and this is what you get, and you're pushing down and you say, this is what you're going to do, it's a contractual negotiation. The only way it works is if both parties agree what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. Something that I would say here when we engage and integrate your lower tiers, if you can identify the limitations of your lower tiered suppliers, you can then produce a quality product. But if you design the product with a perfect supplier in mind, you're probably going to be very disappointed as you go down the APQP chain. Now, the fourth rule, this one should be pretty simple. You've got these robust communication channels here. So what I'm going to ask you to do is you're going to communicate often and you're going to communicate early. I once had somebody tell me that communication and information needs to be treated like produce. It needs to be fresh and it needs to be local, which means I need the information in a way that allows me to take action, and it needs to be relevant to my sphere. This is a big one that a lot of APQP speakers miss. In this diagram right here, for those that speak APQP, these are traditionally the phase milestones, right? There's the milestone for 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's phase 1, there's phase 2, there's phase 3, there's phase 4, and lastly 5. Now, notice here, the milestones of a traditional APQP provide a chance to check the progress. So as an example, when you're coming in and you're saying, you know what, I'm going to leave product design. Do I have my DFMEA? Do I have my prints? You can check to determine whether or not it's there, but it will not allow you time to correct if you are off course. We need to then put in communication channels that allow us to communicate at a frequency that we have enough time to correct the behavior, to correct the deficiency. So let's say that we get to the point of process design. We're kicking off the drawing. So the drawing is about to go over that magic wall to process, and we still cannot agree on the tolerance of an outer diameter. If we wait for the end of phase 2 to determine that, we are probably in really bad shape going out of phase 2. So our communication plan has failed. Now, one of the things that I kind of want to cover here, let me go ahead and stop this for a second. I want to give you a little tool here. Actually, I'm going to give you two between this one and the next one here. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share. We're going to do a little bit of live draw. It's important that we understand how the communication chain largely works. So stay with me here. Okay. Bring this up here. All right. Cool. All right. So when we have issues, one of the things that I find very beneficial is a conflict escalation plan. So early in our APQP activity, we need to determine what we are going to communicate, with who we are going to communicate, and how long we are going to let any conflicts raise. So it would look a little bit like this. If I brought this into a 2-axis thing, this goes up the level all the way from the supervision to, say, the director level. And this is the timeline. If we have disagreement here, we might try to handle it ourselves. But if it gets to this, we're going to go to supervision. If it gets to this time, we're going to the upper level. And as time clicks on, when do we raise it to the director level so that we can let the big dogs hash it out? Somebody once told me early in my career that no contract equals conflict. You might experience it as good fences make good neighbors. Failure to have a contract is a 100% guarantee for conflict, because if there are no rules, nobody knows exactly who's on first and who's on second. So while in rule 2, we might have taken a look at the multi-directional and robust nature of these communication channels, without the appropriate frequency, it will never work. Now, the example that I was kind of giving you there that we put into a chart form, let's take FMEA as an example. So let's say you're in phase 3 of APQP and you're creating a PFMEA. If I have a severity of 9 or 10, who do I tell? When do I tell? Anything that's high AP with an unfeasible action, how do I bring to the table? If I'm telling my C-suite monthly that we have a high AP and it's economically unfeasible, that's going to be my frequency. That's my escalation plan. No escalation plan for conflict is going to be a problem. And so while we have those robust channels, the frequency and the quality of that communication is going to be important. Now, 5th rule, understanding all the requirements. And this is one both suppliers and customers are generally guilty of. I want to talk to you about 2 different ideas here that come up from the FMEA as an example. So the FMEA training that we do, this is one of those things that a lot of customers struggle with. And you mentioned that this is one of those things that your organizations don't do really well. So a function is something that is carried out and can be measurable by multiple requirements. The thing that I bring up here, we can talk about delivery of parts. Delivery of parts, pretty simple, right? That's the function. But notice, correct day, correct time, correct quantity. These are all their own unique requirements. So when you say understand all the requirements, not only do you have to understand the implied, let's say, or I should say the expressed, but also the fact that those could lead to multiple different requirements for the exact same function. As an example, stopping the car probably means in the right distance and under certain operating conditions with the right pressure. All three of those have to be there. Many companies do not solicit the regulatory and safety from the customer. So what happens is, because they don't know your application, they may not be aware of your safety and regulatory commitments. So on the customer, it is on you to pass that down. Again, coming back to the technical knowledge from rule 1. And then for my subject matter experts, for my suppliers, augment what the customer tells you with your own known requirements. One of the things that we do here at Plexus is when I go in to facilitate requirement exploration, when I go in to facilitate contractual and APQP work, there are techniques we use like operational definition, where we come in and here's the supplier, here's the customer, we start listening, and then we facilitate that interaction. Understanding all of the requirements is different than getting a scope of work, looking it through and going, yeah, I think we can do that. Yeah, I think we can do that, eventually leads to, oops, we missed that. All right. So rule 5 is understanding all the requirements. And lastly, unless you like doing work twice, rule 6 is about adopting changes into the organizational knowledge structure. What you learn from that deployment will pay off in other deployments. Now, if you are committed to using the same suppliers, here's the thing. When you look at the IATF in ISO had 7 principles when it came to quality management systems. One of them was relationship management. That applies to suppliers. If you're going to use the same supplier time and time again, supply chain learning management systems are quickly becoming the way that happens. As an example, we have these 2-hour boot camps similar to the 1-hour seminar that you're going through right now. We can bring those in and you can open those up to your suppliers who may not otherwise either want to pay for it, may not have the time for it, and it's modular enough that you can get them the training you need only when they need it. Because what's going to happen when you learn something in this job, feeling out a new supplier, and you want to take them to the dance for the next one, you want that to transfer over. So these 6 rules are universal to aerospace, automotive, medical device. You need an effective and competent multidisciplinary team. You need a multi-directional communication channel. Let's do it this way. You need to engage and integrate your lower tier suppliers as early as possible, even if you don't have all the answers. Communicate often and communicate early with that supplier through that communication channel on behalf of the team. As the job matures, understand all of the requirements. And if there's questions, use a tool like operational definition. And lastly, once you've learned the lesson, unless you like doing work twice, adopt that change into your organizational knowledge structure. And the last thing I'll leave you with 2 minutes to go before we open for Q&A. The PPAP that is delivered on behalf of APQP is the first place you should go when contractual obligations and discussions arise. So when you get that customer complaint, you need to go back to the PPAP to determine if what you sent was different than the PPAP. So unless you like just accepting every customer complaint that comes down the pipe, you're going to want this change and the adoption of the PPAP into the organizational knowledge structure to know what the commitment was that you signed up possibly years ago. Because years ago, whoever made that deal for your organization probably is not with your organization any longer. All right. That's the difference between having a culture based on an individual and having a culture based on the organization's culture. All right, Bill, with that, why don't we go ahead and open up for questions? I am officially done with the 6 rules here.
Okay, first question. When preparing bids early, in the early stages of a project proposal, there's no guarantee program will be awarded, but it is when the biggest investment in resources is required for proper planning. How do you recommend companies take active approach in staffing correctly investments so that the proper planning can be executed from the get-go rather than the opposite, where they staff up to address the issues when it's too late due to proper planning?
Okay, so what you're saying is you've taken on the job. There's a lot of work around getting a request for quote together, not knowing if you're going to be the chosen one, let's say. So how do you ramp up appropriately? The short answer is historical data, right? This is not going to be your first rodeo. So as an example, when you know that you've got the, say, a certain cycle time that you can hit or what you can't hit, you take that cycle time and you apply an appropriate amount of fudge factor, let's say, to it, and you know your current staffing. As an example, in my businesses that I go through and work with, we do what we call the top three, where you've got a long-term goal, a mid-term goal, and something that gets knocked off that day. So I know where my engineers are allocated, and I always go from the worst case scenario. If you come in under labor and you have to come back for more money, then it makes it look amateurish. Whereas if you overstate it and you come in under, that makes it look like you were efficient and you were actually planning for worst case.
Okay, next question. We have a great handbook to develop DFEMAs and PFEMAs. The AIAG VDA handbook includes the golden rules for PFEMA in there. But how about control plans? Where can we find the golden rules for good quality control plans?
All right, now I'm going to give you what I know out there in the industry. Our training on the PFMEA to control plan linkage that Plexus does covers that exact linkage. So right now, I would say that, Bill, if we're taking notes, that may be a good example for a golden rule for the next, seminar. But right now, the best place to go for golden rule in terms of control plans is the PFMEA control plan linkage from Plexus. In that class, we go through them both.
And something I hear frequently, I know you hear frequently, and we've discussed it before. Organizations struggle to get a valid approved drawing out of the supply base, and has caused many challenges for successful launch. What are your suggestions in achieving that goal?
Can you repeat that one more time? I formulated the thought, but I want to make sure it's right.
The challenge of getting the valid approved drawing to develop your APQP. What do you suggest on achieving that goal, and how do you?
Yep. In that one, there's no shortage of, say, drawing rev. I used to use the term, say, design freeze, and a design freeze is a lot like Sasquatch. Everybody's caught glimpses of one, but nobody's actually ever seen one. So a lot of times with the drawing, I will ask for a preliminary print, and I say preliminary. As an example, let me give you this for 2 minutes, and I'll give you just a real quick example, and then we'll continue the Q&A. If I am the supplier, and this comes from our training here, so this is a real training example. This also happens to be one I worked with in real life. We were doing cabin filtration systems for a company, and they gave me this. This was all they gave me. They said, here's the inlet where the air goes in. This is a bushing. This is plastic. And this is filtration media. Can you quote this in 3 days? And by the way, this is around 14 inches long. Even from this, start with what you know. Even from this, do I know that I will have a bushing load station? Sure. Do I know that I will probably have to have the correct number of bushings? Sure. Does it matter if it's 102 or 32 or 1 by the time it gets done being drawn? No, it doesn't. Doesn't matter to me one bit. So what I would say, if you are starting APQP, it is not uncommon that you will not have every answer right off the bat. Start with the back of a napkin sketch and develop a family PFMEA and process flow that gives you the adequate information you need to quote. Leave yourself some room for things you don't know as it evolves.
Okay, when a customer makes a revision in the part after you have submitted your, have a PPAP approval, is it necessary to make a new APQP?
No, it is necessary to evaluate the change, right? Because in phase 5, there's feedback, assessment, corrective action. You evaluate the change, and then it largely goes into the change management portion. And whatever activity comes about as that change, you wouldn't necessarily go all the way back through product design, process design, you to deal with your change management. Because change management would say, what is the change to the existing product? What is the change to the existing process? What are the changes to my process as it exists after mass production? Yep.
Okay, all things being equal, what have you seen as the best approach when doing a launch? Having the same team launch and keep the project, or have a dedicated team for launching and then handing off to a customer focused team?
110% across the board, having the same team that launches it be the one that is responsible for it. If you have what you call advanced launch teams that launch the product and hand it off, what I have found is that that two-way communication does not work very well. And I know in larger organizations, many of you probably on this call are part of those advanced launch teams. If it's working, awesome. But I will tell you the best ones that I've worked with have their hat on as the program, say, developer from the engineering side. And as soon as we launch, they turn their hat around and now they're the manufacturing engineers that work on it.
Okay, and how do we avoid moving from one phase to another, possibly missing important steps in an effort to reach the launch milestone without having to go back to the previous phases and fix all the misses?
Very simple, but not easy. It's discipline. Think about discipline in the human creature. Human creatures always think we're better than we are. So even in, and I'm not going to tell you, I'm not Pollyannish enough to say that I've hit every milestone with every deliverable for every project. Your management weighs the risks to missing that deliverable versus the risk to missing the milestone, and they make a risk-based calculation, and then everybody signs up. There is no magic bullet other than discipline. What I find, and this is universal, people, human beings like systems, but the minute the system gets in the way of what they want to do, they treat everything as an exception. So there is no perfect answer. It's 100% organizational culture and discipline.
Okay, during Rule 3, you mentioned that the lower tiers need to be engaged as soon as possible, even when the design is not frozen. The problem is if the design is not frozen, every change on design would imply a modification, usually increasing of cost. What do you suggest to find a balance between kickoff supplier early and avoid increased cost?
No, and this comes back from working with the same supplier again and again. Know what your supplier is capable of. I had suppliers where I knew that to design a tool, to cut a tool, it was going to take them 6 months. And I had some suppliers that I knew could do the same thing because of the nature of their business in 4 months. So while I might give them appropriate information early on, I would never engage the group where I needed 4 months, let's say, when I was still playing it 8 months out. Now, I would also limit the information. They may not need to know all of the details, and we certainly don't cut tooling, but we need to say, hey, listen, we're on for this. This is what I'm thinking. This is the person I'm thinking about bringing to the dance. How do we bring them in so that they're aware of it and we can start the conversation? Remember, it's kind of like dating, right? When you go on the first date, it is not a guarantee to marry somebody. So treat it very similar to that.
Okay, APQP is a rather time-consuming process. How can organizations deal with short cycle demands by customers focused on quick delivery of products?
110% family PFMEAs, family DFMEAs, or what we would call foundations. Family control plans, IATF allows for family-based control plans such as screw turning machines, right? A screw turning machine and a screw turning machine. And so that modularity really allows for what I call modular APQP. You take your modular PFMEA, you take this station, and this station, this control, that control, and you build it. And then you are only looking at the deltas. That's one thing that the AIAG VDA handbook brings to us and now really pushes on. And also things like we talked about AIAG CTS software. If you have your foundations in that CTS, it really is. I need one of op 20, one of op 30, one of op 60, and that becomes my new configuration. So the trick to APQP is not reinventing the wheel each time. And also, when I teach APQP in our APQP training, you start off with the APQP in initiation, evolution, and then maturity. Do not wait for the maturity stage and try to get it all done at once. You eat the elephant one bite at a time. Now, that being said, Bill, before we go to the next one, I'm going to go ahead and launch our final poll. What is it that you folks find the most challenging about APQP? All right, Bill, what do you got?
Okay, what is the most common mistake when design reviews come in place during APQP? What is the best way to enhance the design manufacturing team linkages?
Okay, when it comes to design review, bar none, the biggest challenge with design review is not having manufacturing representation at that design review. Because here's what happens with designers, and I love designers. I was part of that group for a long time. Designers design in the theoretical perfect world, and then they throw it over and they say, well, manufacturing can't manufacture it. And so that design for manufacturability review needs to be integrated into each one of the design reviews. So maybe in the early stage of design review, you're looking at, say, validation results, but I would also bring design for manufacturability in to determine how that stage of the design is working toward the manufacturability. That is a piece that is missed across the board.
Okay, and how do we overcome lack of gauging history, equipment setup, instruction histories, operating process setting histories, etc.?
Okay, so this is the first time you've ever done it and you have no example. Over control. Prepare your control plan from a very stringent standpoint and make your validation testing of process robust. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you are looking at setup history. And so you're looking at certain process settings for, say, pressures when it comes to injection molding. Your validation testing needs to be tested at different variable levels to a more stringent level, and your monitoring needs to be increased at least 2.5 to 3 times what you think it needs to be, which comes back to APQP. If you have no history and you're planning on doing 5 parts an hour monitoring, I guarantee you that 5 parts an hour will not be adequate. You need to triple that inspection cost, 100%. Without history, you have to segregate. And when we do this for SPC MSA training, there's 4 stages. There's process exploration, there's process validation, and then there's process segregation. Segregation means keeping the bad parts in the plant. We try to jump right to process control. It doesn't work that way. Process segregation is one of those where you want to practice keeping the bad parts in the plant and not letting them get out. So triple your inspection cost.
So, and everybody, I do know that we're running over. We will continue to whittle through a few more questions here as we go along. A copy of the on-demand presentation, you'll receive a link so that you can go back and review it. Also, we will have some people following up with everybody who's in attendance at the webinar, and they will be able to answer your questions, or if they can't, they will engage the appropriate person to answer your question. So the next question is, do you find the successful APQP is run by a single project manager that tracks, coordinates all projects with the different functions, or assign different owners based on the processes?
All right, so let me kind of give you one more thing here. And so, Bill, this is probably going to be the last one that we'll do here, because I do want to kind of share results. And this is going to be a little longer one. But if you asked a very great question, I'm going to give you one more tool. Okay, one quick live draw on this, folks. In the IATF, section 5.3 talks about responsibilities and authorities, right? When I run phases, the 5 phases of APQP: plan and define, product, design and development, process, design and development, product and product validation, and then feedback, assessment, corrective action. These are the 5. Now, there's a dichotomy here. Responsibility has to be measured and balanced against authority based on the fulcrum of role. So what I do and what I have seen work is a peer-reviewed structure. As an example, I have a different leader for each phase. As an example, we'll make this abridged because I know we have a certain amount of time. Let's say sales has the most to lose in the plan and define phase. They're interfacing with the customer. Product design has the most influence in the product design and development phase. Manufacturing engineering has the most influence in process design. QA has the most influence here, and manufacturing has the most influence once it actually hits the floor right here. What I will do is I will assign a different leader to every phase, and sales will sell the project to product design. Product design will sell the project to manufacturing engineering. Manufacturing engineering sells the process to QA, and QA presents it to manufacturing. I take the program manager completely out of the ownership cycle. You know why? They don't have any authority. So why would I give somebody responsibility when they don't have any authority? So to your point, Bill, wrapping this part up here, what I'm going to say is I give the authority for each phase to a different leader, and that promotes that small team unity because you are now directly responsible to that same first team to get a good product through the phases. That has been my most effective one. I would not have the same project leader run the same APQP program because they have very little authority to get people to do what they need them to do. That leads to missed milestones.
Okay, and I have a bunch more questions, guys. Please, as we follow up with you on these, let us know what your questions are. We'll be happy if we can't answer them. We will address Jeremy specifically and get the answers that you're looking for. So with that, Jeremy, you're going to go through the results.
I just shared them out here, and the good news is it's something that I talked about. A majority of what I read and do with my small team development is around the human thought. And again, collectively, you are unique but not different. A fair percentage of you, a disproportionate percentage of you, said that the problem with APQP is not even necessarily collaboration, communication, balancing. It's just having discipline. That's it. It's cultural, organizational politics. It's organization. And it's the discipline to do what you know you should be doing. You know all the right answers. That's why I said it was simple, but not easy. So good news is you are unique, but not different. And you are not out there alone. I guarantee you. All right, Bill.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much. We do have another webinar coming up next week regarding the comparison of SJ 1739 versus AIAG VDA. If you haven't signed up for it, if you reach out to us, we'd be happy to provide you a link to sign up for that. We do have a series of, Jeremy brought them up, LVSs, which are just like a webinar on steroids. It's a 2-hour versus a 1 hour. Gives you a quick, fast learning on the different topics that Jeremy has presented here today. Also, like I mentioned, we are dipping our feet in the pond of information security, 27001, CMMC, NIST, TZAC, things of that nature. So as we follow up, please take advantage of the fact that we will be happy to answer any questions you have. Just let us know what they are, and we'll be happy to address them accordingly. So thank you very much for attending. Excellent attendance, some excellent questions, and I apologize we didn't have time to get to them all.
All right. See you guys later. See some of you next week.